Welcome Dr. Michael Hepworth. Dr. Hepworth currently lectures at the University of Sunderland. He holds teaching experience in different academic institutes in Spain and in the UK. He has over 20 years TESOL experience. He has been a teaching fellow at the Leeds University and is currently an associate lecturer at the Open University. We have waited a long time, and I'm really pleased to see you walking, like I said, to have Dr. Hepworth speak to us. So let us waste no more time and welcome him with a resounding applause.
I hope I can live up to that. I'm delighted to be here. I've been here before. I always enjoy coming down here to the wonderful city of York and to this institution. So I'm conscious of the fact that I hope you've had a productive day, but this is the kind of last slot. So I guess you've been, you've kind of conferenced out. So I hope that I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes. Is that right? About 20 minutes. And then what I want to do is to leave some time for questions. And really the main thing that I want to leave you with today is kind of questions. I want you to think about some of the things that I'm going to kind of pitch. Because really what I'm going to pitch today is an argument. And I'm going to pitch it within a certain context. But it, even if you don't share the context in which I teach and research, one of my other claims, which I'm not going to state explicitly beyond now, is that I think that a lot of these issues are relevant whatever your teaching context. So I want you to kind of bear that in mind as we go through, that I'm going to kind of pitch it in a particular context, but I want you to think about any context that you're familiar with or that you might be wanting to go and work in. So as you can see, basically I want to argue for the value of controversy, of disagreement. My kind of area of research is argumentation and the value of debate, and I want to kind of very strongly suggest that while it is risky, it is a risk worth taking. Indeed, I would say that if we don't take that risk, then we actually devalue the teaching and learning process. So I'm going to pitch that argument to you. I should say that I've taught in schools, so I've worked in a schools context, as you've just heard, so I've worked with kids. I'm going to talk about an adult context, but actually, have worked with kids in schools on argument and debate, so I think that it doesn't necessarily have to just be an adult ESOL thing. So I'm just going to briefly kind of frame the topic, what is controversial and what's not, and why it's difficult to say. That's my main argument, that it's a valuable activity. And I also want to say something about the role of the teacher in debate, because I think that's quite an interesting dimension for me. What does the teacher do during debate? What's their role? Okay, and I've got a particular point to make about that as well. So basically, just very briefly, because it's impossible to say, I think, although that people might conventionally say politics and religion, don't talk about those things. I just want to, lots of this work was done in schools, so Stradling et al. Said basically, what is a controversial issue? So it's problems and disputes, so that involves risk to begin with, which divide society. So it's quite tricky. Significant groups offer conflicting explanations, there's that word conflict, and alternative solutions based on different values. So what we're talking about today is we're talking about people who have different values, different beliefs, different identities. So actually, when we're talking about controversial issues, one of the the risks is that it engages the emotion, especially that clearly it's things people feel passionately about. So I think that that's the emotional dimension and how that interacts with the rational dimension is quite an interesting topic. So controversial issues arouse strong feelings. The second thing that I want to make, second point I want to make is that what might be controversial for me might not be for you. So what we see as controversial has to be situated, and that involves all kinds of contexts. That might be an individual matter, but it might be a societal matter. It might be what the particular context in which you are working, what the particular culture in which you're working, the particular government under which you're working. So actually, clearly it's a movable feast. It's difficult to define what they are. However, we need to say something, and I think that's a reasonable starting point for us. So basically, my context is what they call Adult ESOL. So I worked for about 7 or 8 years at what's now Leeds City College. So I taught adult migrants to the UK, so migrants from all over the world. So quite a diverse cohort of students. So I'm going to talk about this context because the data that I show you is coming from this context. But again, please don't think that it only applies to this context. You know, think about other contexts and how these points might apply. So I'm working with adults. So you know, does that make a difference? Well, it might do. We might expect adults to bring greater levels of maturity to debating controversial issues. That doesn't mean to say, it's an interesting question, because it doesn't mean to say that there won't be problems, but, you know, that I'm talking about adults here, not children. Okay, however, I have worked with children as well on that. So I'm talking about them having general ESOL classes. So by that I don't mean citizenship classes, although I'm going to introduce citizenship. I don't mean EAP, English for academic purposes. I mean general English at all levels of the national curriculum. So I guess in EFL terms it's everything through beginners, intermediate and advanced. So these were general classes. And I'm going to say something about that critical pedagogy, because my argument would be that there's a tendency under what I'm going to call neoliberalism, which I see as the current orthodoxy, politically and economically, to see pedagogy, as Giroux says, as a kind of, almost like a kind of pre-packaging of a particular subject according to a particular set of strategies. So if we apply that to English language teaching, we'd teach this thing called the English language, and we'd have a set of strategies that you would learn about on teacher education courses in order to present this topic to the students. I'm going to problematise that. That's not really what I'm interested in, and it's not really part of my argument today. I come from a tradition that's inspired by kind of Paulo Freire, really, which views teaching and learning as deeply embedded in relationships of power, concerned with ethics and social justice. Controversial issues are often about those kinds of things, so it seems a particularly appropriate lens to me there. It's difficult to pretend that there's anything neutral about controversial issues when you're debating them. It's almost impossible to maintain that. And what is this pre-specified subject matter? Well, there's no such thing as just teaching English. Actually, a whole host of things. There's rather a nice image about English as a kind of many-headed hydra. So English is many things in many contexts. It's not just a kind of nicely packageable thing that we go along and then we teach according to an unproblematic set of strategies. So that's kind of my context. I see it as all about these things. That it's all about context of teaching and ethics and social justice. I'll say a little bit more about that. So why did I get interested in this? Well, I saw kind of, within my area, I was very interested in a particular problem, you might call it a paradox. So there is now, not just through me, but there are other people now saying that debating controversial issues is of value in the language learning classroom. There is research evidence attesting to this. That doesn't mean to say it's not problematic, but there is now a kind of growing body of research evidence which suggests that it's valuable in some way. So Cook and Roberts, I've written about it myself, but other people have written about it within the last year in the Adult ESOL context. We'll think about why that might be shortly. However, the other thing that I noticed alongside of that was, and again, I'm going to pitch this in a kind of polemical way, so you might want to disagree with me on this. When I look at the materials, I don't see much controversy. What I see actually is stuff that's often quite bland. So if you look at global textbooks, what I'm going to call global ELT textbooks, generally speaking, a lot of the controversy, for perfectly laudable reasons perhaps, is often bleached out, is often gotten rid of. Well, so where do we bring in that stuff if it's valuable? Because it doesn't seem to be there in the materials. Furthermore, I've spoken to a lot of teachers about this, and I'll be really interested in your views here today. A lot of teachers said to me that, oh, trying to avoid controversy in the classroom. I tend not to engage in. If something comes up, I tend to close it down. So that's a really interesting question, which is not a yes/no question. But so I did some teacher interviews, teacher focus groups, and I asked teachers, you know, what do you do? What's your stance on this? You know, do you engage in these kind of debates, or do you shut them down? Do you try and keep them out of the classroom? So there's a kind of paradox there for me, which set me going, and I thought, well, I want to find out a little bit more about this. So, if you're going to argue anything, I think you need to kind of say, well, look, it's risky. I'm not saying that we should go in and deliberately be controversial in a kind of in-your-face way. I mean, clearly there are risks, and these risks are attended to. Sorry, I'm trying to avoid standing in front of the slides. So I would say kind of chief among them in terms of the kind of populations I'm thinking of here is the risk of offence, of causing offence. I would say that's a bigger societal risk, and I'd say that idea is quite a big one within education now. So we have a big no platforming policy for the NUS, so that's quite interesting to me. Well, why do we have that? The risk of offence is right at the top of that agenda, and I think that there's a debate to be had there. So not just to individuals, but to particular communities. If we're talking about refugees and asylum seekers, and I heard it mentioned earlier on, and I've done a lot of work with refugees and asylum seekers, then people would say, well, look, there's a risk of trauma. Certain populations of students have experienced traumatic lives, traumatic passages to the UK. Well, why would you deliberately, or why would you allow space for controversy that might be potentially traumatic and add to that? Sometimes it's expressed in terms of, look, the classroom should be a safe haven, it should be a refuge, as Hodge and Pitt say, from the trauma outside of that. Should be a safe space, which is another metaphor that's very common at the moment. One of the interesting ones for me is when we got into the role of the teacher is indoctrination. Well, it's not the role of the teacher to have a view. They're indoctrinating students. I'd really like your view on that. We'll come back to that. But in his work in schools, Stradling talked about that. That's dangerous. The teacher's got to handle that quite carefully, right, if they're expressing their views. And of course there's the kind of the need to be inclusive in a diverse world. This is all laudable. These are perfectly laudable reasons why you might want to be careful of controversy. However, I say yes, but. So this is the pitch. You could conceptualise the classroom not just as a safe haven, but as a kind of classical agora. So the classical agora basically was in ancient Athens. Basically, that this was the place where people had public debates. This was a kind of place of civic debate where the issues of the day, where democracy was enacted. So, well, why shouldn't the classroom be a place like that? And I'm going to link that to the idea of citizenship. The classroom is quite a powerful place. So, for example, in adult ESOL classrooms, so adult migrants in the UK, they're often very diverse. I know other classrooms might not be such, but actually I would argue that adult migrant classrooms in the UK are often very diverse, much more diverse than other social groups might be. And this makes them quite powerful places in order, where we might debate issues of the day which may or may not be seen as controversial. How should we organise society? What is the good life? These big questions which are often touched on in terms of matters of religion and politics. So it's a way of kind of understanding how do you see the classroom, classical agora or safe haven. In reality, it could be both, right? So it might be points on a continuum there. How do you see your own classroom? I think it should at least be partly seen as a place of robust debate and connected to democracy. So I've got two arguments to make. We should debate controversial issues, very important, and that teachers should participate in these debates, not stay back all the time. So I'm going to argue in terms of the first one. Well, I think it's beneficial in terms of language learning, and it's beneficial in terms of citizenship. So there's kind of two strands to that argument. And citizenship, I want to focus on this idea of participation, which connects to democracy, that we should all participate meaningfully as citizens in our society. And the classroom can be one of the sites in which we do that, depending on what kind of classroom it is and how it's organised and how it's set up. So that's the first argument, so I'll speak to that now. Just to say again, I'm going to focus on one issue really, which, although it's a little bit back in historical terms because it's 2009, it's a kind of touchstone issue, and it makes the point that I want to make. I think there are plenty of issues that I could make relevant since then. So in 2009, the kind of austerity government, the Lib Dem, the Con Dem as it's called, coalition, decided to cut funding for ESOL classes. So, for example, economic migrants to the UK who had classes for free were suddenly asked to pay half for their classes. Now that might not seem like a big deal, but they were asked to make a substantial contribution overnight for their classes. So, some teachers in some classrooms actually debated this. So they had debates with their students about, well, you know, what's the policy? What reasons are offered? Why might they be asking us to do this? What do we think of it? Is there anything we can do about it? And there's research evidence again, and not just through me, but through Briers et al., who work in London, do a lot of work in Tower Hamlets, for example, clearly up migrants, said that actually it led to some very productive language work. We'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. I've been involved in projects which suggest that debating controversial issues can lead to extended turns of talk in the classroom, which is something that in the Adult ESOL classroom has been kind of identified as a need, as a lack. So there's a kind of research base for this. But just very briefly, I want to pin it on some specifics. So for example, when I did my PhD, which was, I was gathering the data just after this came in, I went into a class and I got set up, got my voice recorder and got the video, and the teacher kind of came in, and right at the beginning of the class, one of the students came in, sat down and started complaining about the new fee regime. And they said, well look, I have to pay £500 now. And then the students started talking about it. This wasn't on the plan, this was right at the beginning. So, well, yeah, it was always half, now I have to pay full. Well, another one says, well, why? The teacher is kind of put on the back foot and said, well, you know, it's going to be a problem, I know it's going to be a problem, we're going to talk about it. And then somebody says, well, nobody's talking about it. So I worked in FE at that time, and there was no discussion about this. It was imposed. It was imposed through government and through the college, the institution of the college. But actually what the students are doing here is they're actually beginning to kick back against this. So democratically, what followed was actually quite a lot of debate in the first 15-20 minutes of this class, with lots and lots of language, where they put this topic on the agenda. So the teacher didn't want to talk about that. Ironically, they wanted to talk about complaining. Which was really good because that's what they were doing, but it wasn't the topic that they wanted them to complain about. So there was a kind of sense in which, well, you know, it was very awkward for the teacher. You know, this is an awkward situation because it's not in the curriculum, it's not what I was going to do, but this is what has emerged. So actually, even if you don't want it to, controversy will out. You'll always get controversy. even if you try and kind of push it to one side. It's how you deal with it, and again, that, you know, there might be implications there for teacher education. It can't be avoided, and I think it's something we should think about in teacher education. Basically, you've got a kind of student-generated curriculum going there, which is quite a nice thing. So instead of like discussing pre-packaged materials, the students actually generated their own materials, and there was lots and lots of language work, discussion, and debate, and dialogue over this. And I'd say that with the beginnings of this, we also have some critical thinking. Debating controversial issues can help generate critical thinking. And if we're going to have democratic citizenship, we need critical thinkers. We can't have citizenship based on just an acceptance of the status quo. So this was quite interesting for me. So there was a kind of participatory, quite a democratic classroom situation. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of this, but just to say that the language learning argument is built on the kind of basis of an approach, I suppose, which comes through dialogue, which comes through socio-cultural theory, which comes from people like Vygotsky, but also more recently people like Swain, and it was brought into second language acquisition by people like James Lantolf in the 1990s, that actually we learn language in dialogue with others. Swain calls it languaging. So actually we problem solve and we engage in collaborative dialogue with others over issues. So for example, if you're debating a controversial issue, you are language learning at the same time. So those two things are not mutually exclusive. I would argue that as here, they're not just learning a language, they are thinking critically. They're developing their critical awareness of the situation. What Freire calls their critical consciousness. They're kind of developing an awareness around this issue, around the power dynamics. Why is nobody talking about it? We should talk about it. They explore the issue. Controversial issues can be very fertile seedbeds for developing critical thinking, because obviously there are multiple perspectives, but also language learning work. So I think a lot of that is happening. And when I first started to look at this, there was a temptation to kind of to separate out the discussion from the language learning work. Well, actually, it's of a piece. They're all together. They come together. So you can tell that all three students are involved here. If you just look at the turns, that they're co-constructing, and actually that the students are in control of this discourse, and the teacher's actually on the back foot. So the teacher's kind of caught. They weren't expecting this, and they're having to kind of defend a policy that I know the teacher that they didn't agree with. So actually there are quite a lot of interesting things happening spontaneously in this classroom. So there are benefits for language learning and for citizenship. Not only did some of the students and teachers debate that in the classroom, they took it outside of the classroom. So we can see the demo here. There were demos in London and in other big cities in the UK where students and their teachers went out onto the streets to try and defend their right to language education. Now, I'd hook that into the research in terms of it's not just about participation in the classroom, it's about participation outside of the classroom, in order for the classroom to be a space which is related to what happens outside. And there's evidence, not just from my research, but from Briers et al. And Andalina, the US-based researchers, that actually if you debate such issues that are about civic matters, that actually it can encourage participation inside and outside of the classroom, which for me is quite a striking thing, and one of the arguments for debating controversial issues. we often hear not just talk about participation in terms of citizenship, but talk about cohesion and the need for tolerance. So clearly that risk earlier of discord, of disagreement, of the potential for conflict, well actually, if we suppress that, how are we going to create a society where people can deal with that outside of the classroom? Why can't we use the classroom to try and help people negotiate differences and disagreement? Well, actually there's evidence that it does lead, or can lead in certain circumstances, to things like an awareness of the need for tolerance. So actually what I found was that when controversial issues came up, often there was a lot of politeness work going on. People were often, not always, often quite careful in terms of the way in which they engaged with each other when disagreement emerged. And actually they were kind of forced to deal with difference when it emerged, more or less successfully. And again, I guess difference will emerge, right? Whether it's inside or outside the classroom, and we have to deal with it as a society in some ways. I would argue that the classroom would be one of the ways in which we can begin to deal with that. So, just very quickly, to show that I'm not talking of, without any evidence here, there's just a couple of quick dialogues where there was a conversation about religion. So, and basically there was quite a lot of humour around it, where people were kind of parodying. So there were, with a group of Polish students, they were kind of parodying Catholic priests. Now I know this is very risky, and however, but there was a lot of laughter as well, and quite a bit of irony and indirectness and face saving, politeness work going on here, where actually people were trying to be respectful. Now it doesn't always happen like that, so I mean there's other people that you can talk to would say, well look, I had a horrible experience in the class, there was an outpouring of racism and we had to close it down. So that's part of the experience too. So I'm not advocating a kind of controversy soaked classroom. I'm just saying that there is a space for it. So actually, Guy Cook says that when controversial issues come up, actually there are valuable opportunities for language learning, because often it generates a lot of creativity. So when people are parodying corrupt Catholic priests, I'm not having a go at Catholics, so but just for example, then it's quite a sophisticated linguistic strategy actually, and they're not just parodying the language, they're parodying the identity, they're engaging in spontaneous role play. And Cook says, well actually, a lot of this kind of stuff comes up around controversial issues, political and religious. So there's a kind of space there. There are opportunities there for language learning, for quite sophisticated strategies to be used. If we have a bland curriculum, then you remove all that stuff, or the potential of that stuff. Just want to say something. I don't know how I'm doing for time, because I've totally lost time. But
you can go on for as long as you like.
All right, okay.
We were due to finish at 5, but
right. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I want to say something about the role of the teacher. So perhaps I'll spend 5 minutes talking about the role of the teacher, and then hopefully invite some questions. So there's my question. So when we have a debate, how far should the teacher, and how far suggest this is a question of extent rather than an either-or question, how far should we be facilitators, and how far should we participate, speaking with our own voices? The teacher is a citizen, right, as well as a teacher. They're not a kind of neutral person in that classroom. They're a human being with identities, with values, and what are we going to do with that? Are we going to pretend that that's not the case? I would worry about that. I think the traditional view, if you like, to teach something is controversial, to present it as a matter on which different views are or could be held, that seems fairly self-evident. To expound those views as impartially as possible, that is impossible, I think. You can try and be detached and try and be fair, but I think your view will come out at some point, but that's okay as well. And to explore without endorsing. So that means that the teacher should not, I understand that to mean that the teacher should not endorse a particular point of view. So I want you to think about that. I mean, what do you think about that as a statement? I've just put how possible or desirable is that? You know, the teacher as the neutral chairperson, if you like. So I got interested in teacher disclosure. So how much of yourself and your opinions and your views do you disclose as a teacher if there's a debate? Okay, so if it's a debate about religion, you know, do you disclose that you're an atheist, for example? Is that helpful? Is that going to cause problems? How does that relate to a language learning, if at all? And what happens when what happens when you do that? What kind of things happen? Well, I mean, I'm not going to kind of go into the ins and outs of this, but I found when I did a teacher focus group on this, there were lots of different views. So basically, one teacher said, I tend not to remain neutral. So they were talking about the Iraq War, and actually this teacher, he gave his opinion. And he said he found that more productive than pretending that he didn't have an opinion, because it kind of modelled an openness in debate, that the teacher could participate, the teacher had a view, and it said it sets the parameters for discussion in a way that pretending that the teacher didn't have a view didn't do. Okay, he said it's more honest and more productive. Somebody else said, well, actually, when the students, and they often do in my experience, students often do want to know what teachers think. You know, it's a good class when somebody turns around and says, well, what do you think about that? You know, what do you think about the debate we've just had? And then another teacher said, well, I only ever give my opinion when asked. So do you disclose? When do you disclose? There are lots of different opinions on this. I'm not pushing any of them, but what I would pitch to you is that teachers, in order to be honest and in order to model citizenship, actually should disclose at various appropriate points. And again, that begs a question. So I'm arguing against a traditional teacher seen as a neutral chair who under no circumstances will reveal their opinion about something. I don't think that's particularly helpful as a kind of blanket statement. Now, I'll finish shortly because I want to get your opinions, but what happens when you do disclose? Well, lots of interesting things can happen, but I found in the kind of data that I got that actually students do want to know what teachers think. So at the top here, somebody asked the teacher towards the end of the debate on capital punishment, what do you think? The teacher discloses, brings in another student contribution, starts to kind of elaborate their argument, and actually the other students then come in and actually say, well, but what about this? So actually a lot of quite interesting things happen there, which is good for debate, good for discussion, and the teacher is showing that they have a view, they pitch it as their own view, and then they can be questioned on that view in the same way that any other student in the class would be questioned on that view. So actually it's doing lots of interesting things, modelling argument, developing argument skills, bringing students into debate, scaffolding critical thinking, helping them to explore it. There are lots of kind of ways in which there is evidence to suggest that this is what happens when teachers disclose. I picked this because it's a kind of positive one. There might be others. So that's kind of what I'm saying, that it can model citizenship in terms of openness and tolerance and participation in a way that just remaining neutral or remaining silent would not do. It's not particularly open. It's not participatory. It's not acknowledging that the teacher too has a view. But there's a risk with that, of course, and we come back to that point I made earlier about indoctrination. Well, the teacher, some students, and this might be cultural, there's some interesting things. I was listening with interest to some of the things said in the previous session about different cultures. The students might see the teacher as having the kind of final authoritative view on the subject, whereas clearly that's not appropriate in relation to controversial issues. There is no final grand statements. There might be a kind of way in which the teacher's influence is seen to be undue influence. It's not part of the teacher's role, it's not part of their job. So there are clearly risks with teachers disclosing. And I'm going to finish with this just to say there are lots and lots of implications for this for how we train teachers. I would argue not just in an adult ESOL context, but beyond that. That teachers need to know how to set up discussions and debates, that there's more than one way of doing it. They need to be able to argue themselves. They need a level of knowledge about who their students are, what they might find controversial, when to introduce something, whether to introduce something. So as a teacher, you're faced with a lot of kind of decisions there. And whether you're a teacher who's got 20 years experience or a teacher who's fresh out of a teacher education classroom, you will be faced with moments of difficulty, of controversy. And in my kind of view, and I'll finish with this really, I think that teacher education needs to acknowledge the role of controversial issues and the value of that a little bit more than it does at present. That's my view on it and my kind of argument, really. I think I'll leave it there and make time for questions, so thank you for listening. Thank you.
Are there any questions for
Yes, I have one.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the linguistic benefits of discussing controversy.
Yeah.
But you can debate things that aren't controversial or imaginary or absurd, and you can get students talking about things that they feel impassioned or personally related to that aren't controversial topics.
Sure. Yeah.
So what are the specific linguistic benefits of debating controversial issues that you can't get in less risky?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I would say, for example, if you think about that idea of if you're a teacher and you decide to have a debate, if you want to set up a debate, so okay, you go to a textbook, you might go to the internet, you might take a current issue. If students are not engaged in any way or impassioned, to use your word, which I think is a good one, if they don't feel a strong connection to the subject, then there are issues around whether they'll be motivated to discuss something that they don't see as relevant, that they don't necessarily see as important, that somebody else has decided for them that they must or might discuss, rather than kind of generating their own kind of curriculum in a kind of Freudian way. So I suppose in answer to your question, I would say that if they're debating something that they really feel kind of passionate about, then obviously motivation tends to be higher, and the focus on expressing themselves and doing that in a kind of considered way, it's quite a challenge, but I think that's where the kind of benefit is. Whereas if I'm discussing something that I don't really feel is, I might not even feel it's an issue actually, then how engaged am I going to be? There's an element of artificiality about that. and I think that would be reflected in the level of the discussion and the quality of the discussion. So there's no definitive answer to that, but I mean that would be my kind of feeling about that. Yeah.
So if we if this was to be implemented, this was happening more often, how do we account for multilingual and multicultural classrooms? Because obviously you have some cultures which are very comfortable with conflict and debate, and then others which are completely terrified of it and really uncomfortable. How do we make it so that teachers can always account for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I worked in those contexts in Leeds. I mean, we had students in the same class from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from all over the world, and I'm not saying that there's an easy answer to that. I think it's about knowing your class, knowing who they are as people, what their backgrounds are. There's a kind of level of that idea of context and a kind of ethnographic almost awareness of who your students are. I'm not it's not like some kind of prescription. It's merely a pitch to say we need a little bit more of this. And I think depending on the kind of classroom, so you've just identified like a very mixed kind of multicultural classroom. I think I would say, well, you have to ask yourself as a teacher not just who your students are, but are you going to just not go there because with all the benefits that might bring, as well as all the challenges? I mean, what would be a reason for not kind of doing that? Well, I think you have to be sensitive. I think you have to know what you can do when with that particular class. You have to get to know the class. You wouldn't kind of pitch up on the first day and then say, well, let's discuss. Let's just talk about this. Yeah, and then like the blue, and then so you'd get to know your class and what they could handle. And I think in terms of the cultural dimension of it, I think that in an adult migrant context in the UK, I think people will have to handle that outside of the classroom as well as inside of the classroom. And I think the classroom is a legitimate space for dealing with it, or for helping students to deal with that. Now, in the context of British citizenship, which is a very controversial notion, there's a lot of talk about social cohesion, and normally in terms of migrants expected to assimilate. But actually I think in terms of social cohesion, I think one of the things that we could do is help students and kind of model a kind of negotiated, we can negotiate difference. So, I've got a different opinion to you. And maybe that's about socialising students. It might be something that's not familiar to them. It might be something that for some is uncomfortable, but I would say that if you work with that at opportune moments, then maybe that's something that they learn. Maybe that's something that you can actually bring into that classroom that some of those students haven't been exposed to before. Now that's a positive slant, but I think obviously you need to do it with care.
Yeah, because on the flip side to that, do we not run the risk of the more conflict adept cultures kind of domineering the less conflict, and less of a debate, more of a, they'll shy away and just kind of accept whatever's been said to them. They won't learn to debate, they'll just kind of...
Yeah, no, I think that's very real, and I know from like professional experience that you need to be very, very careful, because people might be wary of expressing an opinion because of some of the other people sitting in the classroom. Whether they're male or female, whether it's which particular country they're from, whatever characteristic it might be. So yes, I think that you need to make sure that, unlike ancient Greece, where if you were female or a slave you couldn't vote in the Agora, that our classrooms are places where everybody feels comfortable and everybody is listened to. And I think that is very, very tricky. I think you're right. My pitch is only that we need some of it, and that there's a potential value in some of it.
I believe we are assuming that the students in the study were about upper intermediate now.
Yeah.
My question is, how would you handle a debate or a controversial issue in a classroom where you don't have this proficiency.
Yeah,
that
like with
proficiency.
beginners, yeah.
And also
yeah.
the risk is not to manage the expectation of the student at the end of the classroom, because if they're not able to express themselves, the risk is to go nowhere at the end of the classroom,
Yeah,
and then not be, they might end up being frustrated, not being able to express themselves. How would you handle that?
yeah, I think that's a really good question. What about language levels? So the data that I was working with there, it was upper intermediate. I don't see a problem. I don't see a problem at intermediate and above. I also think that there's a level at which you can work with beginner. I mean, obviously, it depends. There are beginners and beginners, but I think that there's a way in which people can begin to express their views. I mean, obviously, the danger with something that's complex, something that's difficult, something where the emotional temperature is high, do you have the ability to kind of express exactly what you mean in the way in which you mean it? I think that's more of a challenge, but I don't actually think it's impossible to work with beginners classes, because I think one of the possible kind of advantages of dealing with this is that people are quite motivated. They want to try and express how they feel about it, and I think you can, and I have, but I think obviously clearly linguistically you need to make sure that people can handle the kind of expectations that you have about what's going to happen. It might be about what kind of debate are you expecting. It's not just going to be, it's not going to go on for an hour and be kind of, have lots of kind of interaction necessarily. It might be on a slightly smaller scale. I think you can do it, but it's more challenging. I don't have any easy answers to that one, but I have been in beginners' classrooms where people have had the language to begin to articulate an opinion and to go some way towards justifying it. And again, linking it to democracy, if we're going to express an opinion, we should have to justify it, right? If you like, in a liberal democracy, and I think that's where it does link to citizenship. We should know, and often students do want to express themselves and are prepared to explain that. But it is a challenge at the language level. It is. I don't have a ready-made solution for that, I'm afraid, but I think it's possible.
I think we could talk for the rest of the evening tomorrow. But there's no other pressing questions. Just like to thank Dr. Hepworth for his presentation.
My pleasure.